Hey everyone, welcome back. It's been quite a while since I last published a video. This spring was just fairly busy for me, and between that and the commission project I'm showing in this video, I haven't had too much time for making any other stuff. But luckily, since I don't do this for money, it's not like I have any sort of obligations or timeline I need to meet anyway. Also, just for the sake of it, I'm trying a different format for this video than the usual, kind of keeping it a bit more loosey-goosey and less scripted and edited. I'd appreciate if you let me know if you prefer this, or if it's better to show slower speeds but only show, like small portions of the painting clips. But onto the painting. This is another Blood Bowl team commissioned by JG Forge, who also compiled and customized this team. And with the minis I'm working with, unfortunately I had to do quite a bit of pinning and such. It was pretty tricky to get them all glued down firmly to their bases after I painted them up as well. That was a little bit of a time sink that I didn't account for, but he's since then updated the models to include little tactical rock supports and such that make the pinning less necessary, so if you do buy the team for yourself, you won't run into that same issue. The request was that I painted this Dark Elf Blood Bowl team in a scheme inspired by the Night Elves from World of Warcraft, with the Linemen being Death Knights, hence the cold gray armor and black cloth and such. The two horned characters are inspired by Demon Hunters with their glowing green patterned skin tattoos, and these glowing green eyes through their blindfolds and glowing weapons. And the rest are all inspired by the Night Elf look with pure white eyes, purple skin, and vibrant hair colors. There were a few other requests I also stuck to, like having purple armor, teal cloth that ties in with the teal glow color on the Death Knights, and non-metallic metal silver for the medals. As usual, I started off with a good bit of airbrushing. Unfortunately, the sort of pseudo-comic-style, darkest dungeon painting style that I'm painting the team in doesn't lend itself very well to airbrushing, so it didn't end up saving me all that much time. But that being said, I started with a bluish purple over everything, which was a good foundation for the cloth, skin, and armor, which can all sort of diverge from this point. I don't want the skin to look undead, I want it to be a warm purpley pink, so I airbrushed a warmer purplish red shade into the skin shadows, and then airbrushed it up with a pale skin tone highlight, although first I experimented with sort of a lavender highlight, which I thought just looked a bit too gray. You can see that I'm definitely getting a lot of spillover on this step, but I don't really mind, since it'll be easy to cover up the skin highlight color on the other surfaces. Then I carefully airbrushed the cloth teal, doing a little masking with silly putty where needed, and doing my best not to spill over too much onto the other surfaces. I started with Pro Acryl Dark Jade, and I tried to get this to cover most of the surfaces, but I didn't really mind if a bit of dark purple was left in the hard to airbrush recesses. The armor I airbrushed highlights onto with a much colder mix of purple, trying to make it specifically look very different from the skin color. Then it was on to the brushwork, just defining all of the colors. First, just working on these 4 combat-looking elves, since I wanted to divide the project up into segments. For some surfaces I used speed paint, some things like the leathers I wet blended quick gradients onto, and some things like the black cloth I just did standard base coats and highlights on. I used to do a lot of wet blending. Honestly, I kind of forgot how much of a time saver it is for really quick color gradients. It's a technique that definitely takes a bit more effort than just a standard base coat, but I think it really helps to save time. You can see that at first I forgot that they should have bright blue, green, or purple hair colors, so I repainted this red hair color as a purple instead. Any teal cloth where the airbrushed border was a bit fuzzy and my airbrush work wasn't quite precise enough, just got a thin bit of teal that roughly matched the color. And from there, then it was on to all the non-metallic metal trim and such, and oh boy, it took a while. It was actually a pretty simple process. I blocked in all the metals with Pro Acryl Payne's Gray, a nice dark desaturated gray-blue color, and then I just layered up multiple times by mixing in more and more Pro Acryl white-blue. Also, as a side note, I have pretty much all of this footage sped up to 3 times the normal speed, just so that I can show a little bit more of the process. Even then, though, I've still cut out most of the footage, so maybe all it's doing is just making people motion sick or something, but please let me know what you prefer. And related to that, I don't really know if it's better to find things to say to narrate over everything, or if it's fine to just leave clips of painting with some background music or something running. I'm still sort of figuring out what style I want to go for in my videos and how long I want to make them and all that, so thanks for bearing with me as I try a bunch of different stuff. Then I applied a heavy black wash all over the model, trying to get those black lined recesses everywhere, which worked great, except for that it really knocked back the progress on the non-metallic metal highlights, which was a little bit of a bummer. The Pro Acryl wash is really good at settling nicely into the recesses, but even then I guess it filtered down the light colors a bit too much. Not that it really mattered too much, it just meant that I had to redo a little bit of highlighting work. Then at this step I took my carbon black from Chimera, and I moved on to blocking in the large pure black shadows. Even using a large brush and trying not to be too precise, this did take quite a while because of how detailed these models are. I decided to come back later to the non-metallic metal, and now I just switched to working on all the other surfaces. I spent a good bit of time warming the shadows of the skin up and layering up nicely to a pale pink, and using very thin layers of that purpley red shadow color to blend the transitions a bit. I wanted to make sure the skin looked fairly smooth and really popped, since one of the main draws of this team is that they are night elves with purple skin after all. Then I highlighted up the armor with a few layers of cold light purple. I wanted to make sure the skin and armor looked very different, so I made the skin a very warm color and I made the armor a very cool color, which I think has the intended effect. After that, it was just highlighting up the other colors, like the teal cloth, the brown leather, and the black cloth. On the teal cloth, I intentionally made very scratchy sort of highlights, just to sort of emphasize the fabric material texture of the surface. I think this also gives a nice contrast in textures on the minis. The skin and the sort of steel and armor trim and stuff looks very smooth and neat, and the teal cloth looks very rough in comparison. There's already a lot of color going on with these minis, so I kept the brown fairly neutral, and that's also why I chose a nondescript dark gray for the other cloth surfaces. And now it's finally back to the NMM steel, just working from that dark gray up through the blue-white, and then highlighting the edges all the way up to pure white. I also added a bit of black into small parts where necessary, but I kept that pretty restrained since all of the steel should look nice and bright and shiny. It also didn't really help that, as you can probably tell, my good workhorse size 1 brush is pretty beat up and doesn't come to a nice pointed tip anymore. That meant that I was a little bit sloppy with some of my highlights, but I got through it well enough, and later I used black to clean up any places like on the armbands and things where the highlights sort of spilled a little too much onto the other part of the arm. The actual colors I chose for the NMM were fairly simple, but I think the effect turned out okay. Nothing too extraordinary or competition winning, but I think it serves its purpose. Plus, there was a lot of steel and metal stuff on these minis, and a lot of minis to do this on, so I had to be a bit economical with my time. Plus, these minis were also already taking a lot of time. I also carefully blocked the eyes in with pure white, and then used my purple-red skin shadow color to clean up the borders around the eyes. After some final steps like highlighting up the hair, they were pretty much done. Now, I won't go over every step on every batch of minis on this project, but there are some more interesting things to talk over. If you've watched my Darkest Dungeon videos, you'll know I've done a lot of exploring for the best way to get those strong black shadows all over the minis, and I decided it was time to give oil paints another shot. And this time it actually worked out really well. First, just to be safe and hopefully change how the oil paints sit on the surface, I gave the minis a satin varnish all over. Once that dried, I slightly thinned down a really intense black oil paint, Mars Black, with a bit of mineral spirits, not too much, just a little bit, and then I applied that liberally over almost all of the mini. I only avoided the parts I knew weren't going to have any black shadow, but even then I went fast and I wasn't really exact about it. I let the oil paint sit on the mini for maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so, but I didn't want to let it dry too much and become difficult to remove. Then I took some small makeup sponges, and this time I got them wet with mineral spirits, and I started lightly wiping off the surfaces. The sponge got pretty saturated with oil paint fairly quickly, so I did keep having to use different sides of the sponge and sort of rotate it around and keep re-wetting it with mineral spirits. But I think this worked great. It took a bit of practice and I didn't execute it totally perfectly, but this got me the exact result I was looking for with the strong black shadows and the sharp lines that divide this black from the rest of the surface. A really nice extra bonus was that in most of the areas that I wiped with the mineral spirits sort of diluted the oil paint that remained in that area, which sort of let it run into the recesses and do a little bit of black lining there, just like a black wash would do. Once that had a day or two to dry, I just varnished it again with a matte varnish, and then did a little bit of cleaning up on some of the shadows with an acrylic black paint. Again, that Chimera Colors Black Carbon. I just really like that color. You don't need to varnish immediately after doing the oil paint, but I did just because the shiny satin surfaces were making it a bit difficult to highlight after the fact, since it was actually kind of hard to see where my highlight was getting applied to and what color it would end up looking on the model. Then, honestly, it was just a lot of the same. The main difference is that on the Demon Hunters I did a few layers of wet blending on the skin since they were such large surfaces that should look fairly smooth. The Demon Hunters also needed their glowing green tattoos, and for that I roughly sketched them in with a very light greenish white. And this is another step where you can see that unfortunately my brush tip doesn't really come to a nice fine point anymore, so some of my lines are a bit thicker and sloppier than I'd like. Definitely time for me to buy a couple new brushes soon. Anyway, I just sketched out some random shapes on the arms and legs and midriffs, trying to keep each side somewhat symmetrical, and looking at a lot of art and screenshots as guidance. Then I glazed over this with some layers of green and yellow paints and speed paints, just kind of doing whatever felt right to get a nice green to light yellow gradient. If I remember right here, the Shamrock green speed paint worked really nicely for this vibrant green color. Then I carefully cleaned up some of the messy borders of these lines with the skin colors, trying to roughly approximate the proper light or dark skin tone depending on where on the skin I was painting. Nothing else too uniquely different on the Demon Hunters. Their fleshy and bony wings and horns and such introduce some new colors, but nothing too different conceptually. Just the usual highlighting and some high contrast between bright highlights and dark shadows. In general on this project, I've tried to make the highlights a bit more blended in places than I typically do with my Darkest Dungeon painting style, and mostly this is because the minis are full of light, bright colors, and I think with all of these different bright colors, really rough, unblended highlights might make the minis look a little bit too difficult to sort of read on the table. I also wanted the skin to look fairly smooth and not too choppy. So there's the Demon Hunters done as well. The other major difference I want to cover with this team is all of the Death Knight linemen. I approached these very differently, starting with a black prime and really roughly sort of overbrushing this dark blue with a big flat brush. If you don't know what overbrushing is, basically it's like dry brushing but still keeping the paint still keeping the paint fairly wet on your brush. I did the same thing in a couple more layers, working up through this dark blue to the faded ultramarine color and up to white blue. With each layer I tried to cover less of the surfaces, and I also switched to a smaller beat up round brush to kind of help with that. As the color got lighter, I also started wicking more of the paint away onto my paper towel, kind of starting to transition it to more of a dry brush, and less like covering an entire surface with wet paint. This is definitely way too blue and way too bright right now, but that's actually intentional because next I use the old reliable, a thick layer of black wash, which nicely tones everything down and desaturates it. With this before and after comparison, you can see just how big of a difference this makes, and it really knocks those colors back. Now time for another neat little trick. I used black speed paint to block in all of the dark fabrics and steel armor areas, but if I was only using black, there would still be a bluish tint in the surfaces showing through the speed paint. So I mixed a little bit of brown into this black, just to add a little bit of warmth that helps to sort of cancel out the cold blue. You could probably get the same result by mixing in a tiny bit of reddish or orange speed paint as well. Then it's back to everybody's favorite, tons and tons of NMM trim. At first I tried using the same recipe as before, but I thought it looked too much like the cold blue-gray of the armor. So instead I went with the most basic option, literally just mixing black and white together to layer up from dark gray to white. I think this worked fairly well, making it look different enough from the bluish armor, but still looking similar enough to all the trim and metal on the rest of the team, so that it doesn't look out of place. I didn't really worry at all about any fancy blending techniques with NMM. I just layered it up in a few layers, not really worrying too much about any special blending or gradients or anything like that, or making it really smooth, since once you zoom out from a few inches away and you sort of put them on the table a few feet away, the effect looks really good. Then back to the regular stuff again. I highlighted the black cloth by mixing in a bit of pale yellow and doing a few scratchy highlights. And I did things like painting the ears and the helmet horns and the edge highlights on all of the armor a bit. And just some simple edge highlights on the armor, not trying to highlight every edge of every surface, just trying to get the most prominent ones to really add that pop factor. Next up was painting the teal glow in the shoulder pauldron eye sockets, the actual eyes, and the little other bits like the helmet crystal and the eye sockets in the belt buckle. To do that, I blocked all of those spots in with pure white, which was mostly easy, except that the eyes were very tricky to get to through the tiny helmet openings. After that, I went back to the airbrush, first mixing up an acrylic teal color that ended up a little bit too blue, and then pivoting to using a speed paint instead, mixing shamrock green with raging sea. This got me a great color that matched fairly closely with the teal used on the fabric for the rest of the team. After some careful airbrushing, I just went back to paint in 1 or 2 highlight dots in each of the glowing sockets as needed. I painted the bases off camera, but they were nothing too unusual, just some dry brushing and quick highlights, a black wash, and some more dry brushing. The tricky part now was actually getting the minis on the base. I drilled pinholes where necessary, often having to adjust their angle, and then glued the minis down. Honestly, this was pretty tough. I had to use pretty much every trick in the book that I know for attaching models. Some of the feet got pinned. The ones that I didn't pin, I roughed up with my hobby knife, and on some of them I also had to put tiny wads of green stuff between the foot and the base and sort of super glue that all together. As mentioned earlier, a couple of them even needed green stuff rocks sculpted for them to stand under to support them. But, as I also mentioned earlier, this stuff has all been fixed in the actual sculpts as well, so if you buy this team for yourself, you won't really run into these issues as much. With the minis actually attached to the bases now, I painted some pure black shadows under each model on the base to sort of cast them in shadow, and I painted these base rims black, and that was that. Well, almost. I had to paint the edges of the base toppers like they were glowing, which also meant busting out the airbrush again to get a glow effect, using masking tape to make sure that none of the glow got on the base or the mini, and I couldn't really be bothered to film any of this, so you can just see what it looks like on the final result. So this was an interesting project. I really liked the result that I got, but it was pretty tricky and took a good bit of time longer than I hoped it would. I'm definitely looking forward to diving back into my painting projects, hopefully powering through Oathsworn soon, and I've already been making some more progress on my Song of Ice and Fire units, and I'm also eyeing up those Slay the Spire board game minis, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And just to clarify, since I probably sounded a little complainy at times during this video, I'm not complaining about this project at all. It was fun, and I'm really happy with the end result. I'm just also very excited to dive back into my own personal hobby projects. So thanks for bearing with me for a couple months with sort of radio silence with no videos. I'm hoping to get back into the swing of things now. As always, I appreciate you all. Thanks for sticking around to watch all this, and I hope you take care of yourself and that you have a great day.